The SuperScript Shawl patterns, both versions, and the accompanying cowl pattern are predominantly garter stitch projects with a few surface embellishments. The first of these embellishments are the 3 lines that run along the lower half of the shawl. Viewed from the front of the finished piece, these lines angle out from the center point. The first step in creating these 3 lines is to create what I call slip stitch canals through the pairing of slip stitches and cross stitches. You see here there is a raised frame in the cranberry color, matching the main fabric of this color block, creating the canal. And inside the raised frame, you see the light blue braid that is running through the center of the canal. Because the projects are knit from side to side, you start with an increase edge, which then transitions into a decrease edge. In order to keep the canals slanting in the same direction as the waxing and waning of the shawl's depth, we need to use crossed stitches. The first of these is the right cross knit purl. All of the techniques explained in the SuperScript video tutorials will be demonstrated on the SuperScript cowl, which uses all of the same techniques, only on a smaller scale. The cowl, like the shawls, is knit flat from side to side. Here I am working on an increase edge and will demonstrate the RCkp stitch, which keeps the slip stitch canals leaning right to follow the angle of the increasing edge. Preparation for the RCkp stitch begins 1 row before the cross stitches are worked. This row begins with a single increase, in this case by knitting through the front and back of the first stitch. The slip stitches worked in this row are necessary to make the canal spacious enough to accommodate the crochet braids that will later be applied in the center of the canals. The slip stitches elongate each stitch and make them and the overall canals open and roomy. When you slip a stitch, you will be slipping it purlwise with the working yarn held to the back. The RCkp stitch is worked on the wrong side of the piece. You will be knitting up to the first slip stitch from the previous row. The way that you will identify that stitch is by looking for the stitch that is recessed from the other stitches just a bit. You can see there is a free strand of yarn floating in front of the slip stitch. When the slipped stitch is the first stitch sitting on the left needle, you will skip that stitch and knit into the front of the second stitch on the left needle. Leave this stitch on the needle and bring the yarn forward. Purl into the first stitch, which was the slip stitch we identified. Now you can slide both worked stitches off the left needle together. Return the working yarn to the back and knit up to the next slip stitch and repeat the RCkp steps. Knit into the front of the second stitch. Leave the stitch on the left needle and move yarn to the front. Purl into the first stitch, then slip both stitches off together. We'll do this once more. So you see with the RCkp row, you've reconciled the angle of the slip stitch canal with the increase that happened in the previous row to make sure they are both keeping to the right leaning angle. Next, we'll learn the left cross knit slip stitch that will allow the canals and in turn the crochet braid inlay to stay in line with the decreasing angle of the second half of the shawl. Here we've reached the center point of the shawl, marked by the navy garter ridge, here. And now we are going to begin angling left with the LCKSL stitch to stay in line with the decreasing angle of the shawl body. And in this case, the cross stitch will be worked on a right side row. You work the LCKSL stitch when you reach the slip stitch column. You will skip the first stitch on the left needle and knit into the back of the second stitch. With the yarn still in back, you will slip the first stitch on the left needle purlwise and slide both stitches off the left needle. Let's see that once more. Skip the first stitch and knit into the back of the second stitch. With the yarn still in back, slip the first stitch purlwise and slide the second stitch off along with it. Thank you! You can proceed to SuperScript tutorial number 2 to be introduced to the applied I-cord bars technique. Meet you there!